Hi there, I'm here with a man who has influenced my life so much, Reverend Ray Thompson. He's been a gentle but solidifying influence in my life since I met him when I was senior minister at Pine Rivers Uniting Church. As you know, I'm no longer with the Uniting Church because of doctrinal decline. But Ray, during that time as a minister in association at Pine Rivers, wrote me a beautiful reference that sent me to tears. And I wanted to have this memory of him and for you to see and hear the life experience of this in short ways of Ray. So this is Ray Thompson. He was also an evangelism consultant, weren't you, Ray?
Yep.
Yep, for the Synod of Queensland too, so he travelled everywhere. So he knows his stuff. Good theological training. It was when the Uniting Church was sound, when they had sensibility and logic, and so he is a real influence, and I love him dearly. And it's just such a privilege, Ray, to have you here.
Good, thank you.
Yes, so I'm just going to stand behind the camera and just ask him some questions, and he's going to tell you a little bit about the story. But thank you, Ray, for everything you've done for God, for His people, and for me.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Ray, maybe you'd like to start with your call to God and what age you were and where you were.
Oh boy. That's going back a long way, mate.
That's all right. People like to hear that. We need to hear that.
I'm a bit of a denominational mongrel because I went to an interdenominational Sunday school as a child.
Yes.
Which was sort of run half Presbyterian, half Baptist, with a few Methodists thrown in for good measure. And that was my Sunday school years. Then I was confirmed in the Presbyterian church, which is where my family had been. And then I left school and went to what was then Northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, and worked on the copper mines up there.
Wow.
To get enough money to go to university, because there was no free university in South Africa at that time.
Right.
And so I had to get the money to go to uni for that particular period of my life. Then after uni I went to a little town in northern Natal, which is now a big city, a big steel city.
Country?
And yeah, it's in South Africa.
Yes.
And while I was in Zambia, in Rhodesia, there were 3 churches in the town called Kitwe. There was the Dutch Reformed Church, because of the language difference. There was the Anglican Church, the Catholic Church, and then what was called the Free Church, which was all the rest, Baptists, Salvation Army, Presbyterian, Methodist, Congregational, the whole works all in one church. So it was like a sort of a church smorgasbord when you went for communion. If you wanted to have communion out of the small cups, you sat on the one side of the church. If you wanted out of the chalice, you sat on the other side of the church. If you wanted to kneel for communion, you went and knelt at the front. Or otherwise, if you wanted to sit in the church pews and be served communion, you sat on the other side.
Wow.
And then you had a small baptismal font for infant baptisms, but then underneath the communion table you had a full-size baptistry.
Wow.
So whatever
That's
happened,
fantastic.
it was fantastic because there was nobody that could say, we've always done it this way.
Wow.
And that was part of my training, starting a youth group in that church and living with that during the time that I worked on the copper mines, and then went to Grahamstown to university after that. And then
Still in South Africa?
Yes.
Grahamstown at university, and what did you study?
Well, the Bachelor of Arts, but with biblical studies and systematic theology majors.
So what made you think you were called to serve God as a minister at that time to do that study?
When I was part of the youth fellowship in my hometown, my home city, East London, we had a youth mission which was conducted by a bunch of student ministers from Rhodes University that came down to East London, which was 112 miles away in those days. And there was this, I mean, having gone to an evangelical Sunday school, I had been faced with the question of giving my life to God for service.
Yes.
All the way through my Sunday school days. And there, sitting in that church, we had we had a program where we visited every single young person who had been confirmed in the Presbyterian church in that whole city over the past 5 years. And this was a challenge just to look at what the gospel really meant and to commit their lives to Christ. And there are a number of people that are in the ministry today. Well, some's now passed on, but some people in that particular group of young people that ended up in the ministry, including myself. And I can remember in that church that night when we had a dedication of ourselves as leaders of the local mission, I was suddenly confronted with this. I want you. And that's how I can remember going home to my mum, who was a real good conservative Presbyterian. And just for the heck of it, I put a shirt on back to front, so I had this dog collar thing there, and I stuck this piece of black material down the front. And I walked out and my mum was washing dishes, and I said to her, "What do you think?" And she looked at me and she just burst into tears. And she said this had been a dream all the way through and so on. Yeah, okay.
Wow.
My first church was in a little town called Newcastle, with another church up the hill that was in the
Still
Natal.
in South Africa, yeah.
That was
not Newcastle and Sydney, yeah.
No. That was Newcastle, South Africa, and up the hill, up the pass was another town called Volksrust, but that was in the Transvaal. And I was in Natal. And then I had another church congregation that met in farmhouses, from one farmhouse to the next. And that was in the Orange Free State, which was a third area in the country. Then I went from there down to Cape Town, and I was in Cape Town for 4.5 years. And the funny thing was that wherever I went, I followed either a man who had resigned from the ministry or had just opted out to change direction in some other way with congregation. Congregational life just wasn't where these new young ministers were at. And so I ended up in Cape Town. Then from there I went up to a city called Vereniging, which is near Johannesburg, and then from there down to Durban. And in Durban, I was again confronted with the fact that charismatic renewal had broken out throughout the whole of the Presbyterian Church at that point. But it was different to what was charismatic renewal here. Here it almost became classic Pentecostal, whereas in South Africa there was the mainline churches, the Pentecostal churches, and somewhere in between with the charismatic renewal. And it kind of grew from a new awareness of spirituality, a new awareness of the presence of the Spirit of God, somehow renewing and making a difference to life. And things started to happen in the church that were achievable because there was no political involvement in it. And yet at the same time it was achieving more than any kind of political demonstrations or anything else could have ever achieved, with congregations in some places becoming multicultural. And I mean, this was when the apartheid policy was still very much part of the life there. And then we had a visit from a minister from Victoria in Australia, and he and his wife were touring South Africa, and she was a teacher for remedial studies and this kind of thing. And we have a daughter who was intellectually handicapped and had all sorts of educational problems and so on. And this was during the days of Gough Whitlam, and she said to me, "Why don't you come to Australia?" Because we were doing all sorts of things over there with remedial work and all this kind of stuff, and that sort of, rang a little bell, but it wouldn't go away. And then eventually I thought I'd phone, or I wrote in those days, and I wrote to the secretary of the Presbyterian Church in Victoria, which was where they were, and said, "This is the kind of training I've had, this is where I've been, this has been my history. Is there a possibility of coming to Australia?" And of course in those days my position in Australia had to be advertised nationwide so that I wasn't taking any Australians' role. But the point was that they had the 4 parishes in
You were ordained at this point?
Oh yeah,
beforehand, yes.
I'd been ordained for 14 years at that stage.
Right, wow.
And
how old were you?
40.
Wow. Okay.
And at any rate, the role that I came to had the exalted title of Christian Education Enabler.
Wow.
Because I'd also been involved in the group dynamics movement in South Africa.
Yes.
And this was also a very strong growth point in my life, and also in the church. And when that blended with the charismatic renewal, it was all sorts of things opened up that blew the mind. And somehow I seemed to tick the boxes that were needed here, so I was given the okay to come to Victoria. And so we ended up in Shepparton, working with the 4 parishes in Shepparton, and the one little parish in Marupna, which is just across the Goulburn River on the other side of the river. And so we started our life in Australia in Marupna.
And what denomination was it?
That I was still Presbyterian in those days, and I came over to the Presbyterian Church here.
Right.
But already those 4 parishes were lined up to join. This was in the year that the union was delayed.
In the Uniting Church.
In the Uniting Church.
Yeah.
And so I was officially Presbyterian, but the congregations I was working with had already declared that they were going into union. So I was part of the Uniting Church when it first began, and that was a year after we got here. And served in the minister in Marupna at that time. He had major health problems, and so he was retired by the Methodist Church, and I was appointed by a Methodist conference to go to this combined uniting church in Marupna before church union happened. And this is typical of my background. To sort of move on from there, I spent 5 years in Marupna going through the whole process of getting them into the Uniting Church, so we could set up the structures and all that kind of stuff. But again, my first 5 parishes, my first 5 appointments in churches, I'd followed either a nervous breakdown or a resignation from the ministry. And I always had this job of sorting out, disaster areas, and grew up with that. And then I got a letter. I saw an advert in the church newspaper that they wanted an evangelism consultant for the Synod of Queensland. And this was something that wouldn't go away. And so I wrote to the person who was heading up the committee here and said, look, this is what I've been doing. This is my idea of what evangelism looks like. And because at that stage, evangelism in Queensland basically meant that a congregation would invite some other person to come in for a week and preach. And,
yes.
and then once you've done that, you were an evangelical congregation.
Yeah.
But my idea was that the congregation was the one that would do the evangelism. And that's how the church...
How did you achieve, because obviously the congregation would have to know the gospel to share the gospel.
Yeah, that's right.
So would your work involve first grounding the people of God in the churches in the gospel solidly?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there were congregations scattered around Queensland that were basically evangelical congregations already, where their sense of awareness of the call of God to share the gospel with other people was real.
Yes.
But there were other places where, I mean, they were more involved in social justice and all that kind of stuff. And so I got into the congregations by becoming consultant for evangelism in the Synod of Queensland. I had an open door to all those congregations that were interested in evangelism.
Mm.
So it was just a case of retuning their thinking away from the idea that you brought in some outsider to do it for you, and the fact that this was the job of the congregation.
Wow.
And we started a program called Risk Evangelism, which had been started in America, in the Presbyterian Church there. And I happened to go over to America as part of the delegation. There were 7 of us from the Uniting Church in Australia went over to be part of the bicentennial of the Methodist Church in America. And each one of us did 3 missions, week-long missions, in different parts. And that helped me to get an insight into what the American church was like, which was interesting. And then and coming back to Australia again, we were just at that point where they were going to renew my appointment for this evangelism consultant role. And I had one of the elders of the Centre City Church, the St Andrew's Church in the centre of the city.
In Brisbane?
In Brisbane.
Yes, that's where my wife and I were married.
Yeah, that's
yes.
Right. And this elder came in one day and he said, look, the minister we've got at the moment is retiring. Would you consider coming to... Because I'd been talking with them about evangelism, so he said, the minister's retiring, would you consider accepting a call to St Andrews? And I said, hey, that's crazy. You know, why would I want to go to an inner city church?
Yes.
The last thing I could think of. I said, for one thing, I don't own a suit. and I mean, this was one of these places where the Sheraton Hotel was across the road from the church in those days.
Yes.
And so if you wanted to interview any of your businessmen in the congregation, you went and had lunch at the Sheraton. And this kind of stuff was so out of my comfort zone. But anyway, I said, no, forget it, I'm not interested in that. But again, it was one of those things that wouldn't go away. And eventually I went and sat down in the congregation, and there was an old minister there who was retired, and his name was Reverend Tom Rees Thomas, Reverend Dr. Tom Rees Thomas. And he was a real character. And he was congregational before Church Union. And he knew how congregationalism worked. And in no time, he closed down his congregational church in Brisbane, and his whole congregation marched up the road to St Andrew's Church and joined St Andrew's.
Wow.
Brought their money with them, which Reed did the pipe organ in St Andrews and a few other things. And he came in and he was sort of retuned the parish council and all that sort of thing, so it was operating more along congregational lines. And I said to these, there was a chappie who was the chairman of the church council, who was a congregationalist through and through, and I said to him, you know, this is what we've got here. He says it's the congregational tail wagging the Presbyterian dog. And he looked at me and he just laughed. And this was the guy that nobody else would accept a call to this place, because they thought that these blokes were too powerful. And they got the giggles over my idea of congregationalism and Presbyterianism. And
so the congregation being the governance of the church rather than
that's right.
a hierarchy.
Yeah. And anyway, I eventually ended up accepting the call there. And then I'd only just started there. And then I got appointed as moderator. And moderator.
How did that happen? You were appointed, because basically St Andrews is considered as the main cathedral, if you were like, if we were Anglicans, the cathedral where the top ministers would go to be placed.
No, it wasn't. It didn't come from St Andrews. It was two separate presbyteries.
Right.
Each presbytery had to nominate moderators elect.
Yes.
And two separate presbyteries had suddenly put my name forward, because at least I was known around all the presbyteries.
Yes.
Because I'd been doing 5-6 years of travelling around talking about evangelism. And so, and then somehow when the vote was taken, I ended up in the job. It blew my mind, but it gave me access to congregations that I had never been able to get into before. Those were social justice type congregations and what have you. And suddenly,
what was missing from those just social justice congregations? Did they have the gospel with it, or was it social justice and the gospel hand in hand?
Yeah, it was kind of there were so many degrees of this.
Yes.
There were people that sort of were interested in social justice and almost used the gospel as a means of achieving social justice, rather than using the gospel as a means of achieving life, which would produce social justice.
Right.
And
I think that's a good point to make for any church today.
Sure.
Yeah, and particularly for the Uniting Church now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I ended up at St Andrews and had a whale of a time there. I thoroughly enjoyed my 8 years of ministry there. And then I was confronted with the reality that I had 8 years left before I was due to retire. And it's a case of, as having been moderator for a year, I could have stayed on at St Andrews for another 2 years beyond the normal period that you went as an appointee. But it was a case of, and then I would have only had 4 years to offer a congregation when I left there. So I decided, well, this was time to move. And just at that particular time, I got an invitation to go to the church in Enoggera, which again was a transitional kind of. I mean, Enoggera was an area that was built mainly by ex-servicemen after World War II, who had got their ex-servicemen's grants and so on, and they were all, that was the age group of the congregation. But they were all high-set houses, and arthritis began to sort of compete with high-set houses, and so these older folks were either dying or going elsewhere where they could get in and out of the building. And so these houses started to be sold. They were at the point of closing down the Enoggera State School because there weren't any children in the area. Now if you go to Enogra, you've got to sign up to get into that school, because it's so, so active and such a young community.
Yes.
Totally different to what it was.
Wow.
And I was there in the sort of transition time, which was a lot of fun and did a lot of crazy things. It was good. Yeah, so, and then I retired, sort of.
At what age?
60.
How long have you been at Enogra, and what age did you retire?
Well, I had 8 years at Enogra, and then I was 65 when I retired.
Okay, and we all know that ministers never really
right.
retire, so continue the story, Ray.
And after Enogra, after I'd retired, I did a year over at Oxley, which is right the other side of the city.
Wow.
Living in North Lakes, I was sort of commuting every day over the other side of the city. And then when that year finished, and they had appointed a new minister there, then I went to Sandgate for a year. And so I filled in there for 12 months. And then I went to Cabourgha, and that was supposed to be for a year. That was 3 years after me. So, but then it got to the stage where the Minister of Pine Rivers, who had been there for 17 years at that stage.
And who was that?
That was Barry Allen.
Yeah.
And Barry came out of a non-churchy kind of background too. And so a lot of the people that he reached out to that caused the growth in Pine Rivers at that particular point were non-church people.
Mm.
And so he had a whole lot of non-church people came into the congregation and became committed Christians.
Mm.
And it was a live kind of congregation. But then eventually, it's amazing how quickly a congregation that has been renewed can get into a rut.
Yes.
And
why do you think it happened like that at Pine Rivers? It got into a rut.
Well, I think it's because they never knew anything else but Barry's ministry.
Okay.
And I mean, I had a personal friendship with Barry, and just shortly before I retired from Enogra, I invited him to come over there and to preach at Enogra. Mm-hmm. And we had a commitment Sunday and all this kind of thing as part of that. And so when I retired, to transfer my membership, seeing that we were living at North Lakes, so to transfer my membership to Pine Rivers was the natural thing to do. And so we were very, very happy there, except that for the first 3 years I didn't fit, I hardly ever attended Pine Rivers for the simple reason that I was off somewhere else doing some other kind of filling in job. And then Barry retired, and he preached there for the last time on Easter Sunday. And I took over the Sunday after that. And that was an interesting experience in that I was the first minister, other than Barry, that a lot of those people had ever known.
How was that for you? How was that for them as well?
Well, initially I was sort of, in the first weeks that I was there, I was kind of lined up after the evening service by a group of young men, and they immediately wanted to know what my thoughts were on speaking in tongues and deliverance ministry and homosexuality and gay marriage and and all these real nice fiery debating points. And it was a case of they were summing up whether they were going to stay or I was going to leave.
What do you think brought it to the head? Were they what you would describe as absolute non-negotiable fundamentalists? Or the fact that that's all they'd ever known?
That was all they'd ever known.
Yeah.
All they'd ever known was Barry's ministry.
Yeah.
And he had not come out of a traditional church background into the ministry.
Mm.
I mean, he was a taxi driver and all kinds of other things before he became a minister.
Mm.
And Barry had a real, in many ways, a real openness to people who weren't church type people. But they brought together in Pine River, they brought together all these different congregations to form Pine Rivers. And that was, I think, the typical thing that happened in the church was when you join a lot of congregations, then you lose quite a number of people who were so committed to that church. That was where all their memories were, where they had their marriages and their baptisms and their funerals and everything else. And when the union happened and they all got together in one building, and also I can remember the meeting of the presbytery when they were discussing the building of Pine Rivers Church, and it was going to be built out of better blocks, concrete blocks, instead of the traditional old church style of building. And that almost blew the mind of the presbytery of North Brisbane, as it was then. But they got their way, and so the church was a very functional kind of building rather than a traditional building. And then I sort of took over there for that, was supposed to be a year, but then after 10 months I had a stroke and 2 heart attacks and ended up in hospital. So I decided that my time of filling in on a full-time basis had to be curbed back.
Yes.
And
obviously, yeah.
And then there were 2 other retired Uniting Church ministers who came in after me. Bruce Ross came in, and then Evan Stenlake came in. Now, I don't think that if you tried to find 3 more diverse personalities, theological styles, worship styles, and all this kind of thing, I don't think you would have found 3 more diverse people than Barry and Evan and myself.
Mm.
But we were all great mates.
Yes.
And but that year that they had sort of taken over wasn't long enough for the people who had only ever known Barry's ministry to adjust to a different style.
Do you think that was because he was there for 17 years?
He was there for 17 years, yeah. And
so the attachment was to the person, and their perhaps with their conversion and Barry, the 2 were hard to separate. Do you feel that was part of it?
Oh, sure. I mean, that I will always think of people that had an influence in my life, and their personality and their life and their style of worship and all that sort of thing influenced me.
Yes.
And I think that what happened was that they had become so accustomed to the way that things happened at that particular style. I mean, Barry got things done in that congregation that the presbytery would say, well, no, you can't do that, but he did it.
He did it anyway?
Yeah, he did it anyway, and they...
Because the ultimate power lies where? Yeah. In the synodical system, where did it lie?
That's right.
In the congregation.
And the church grew.
Yes.
But then, of course, after all these breaks in between, then you came.
Mm.
And I mean, you didn't have a particularly uniting church background, just as Barry didn't.
Mm.
So your style of ministry was different again to Barry's. And the difference between the 3 of us that had filled in there in the meantime was that they could work on the basis that, okay, we stay here, we belong in this place, these guys will move on. But when they got a permanent minister, then you suddenly found that there were all these people that had... And one of the things that I found interesting about that congregation was that I think there were 7 PKs, parsons' kids.
Pastors' kids?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in many ways, people who had sort of rebelled against the traditional churchy thing and found Barry's style of ministry a refreshment from what they had known all their lives as kids. And when that church eventually split up and into two separate congregations, all of them went to the one congregation, and the others that remained had none of those PKs left in it. Fascinating. And but now, with my wife having dementia, and with my health, I'm having gone through open heart surgery and pituitary tumor removal and thyroid gone and gallbladder gone, and when all the ministers get together for their 6-monthly luncheon, you've got to go along half an hour early so that you can have all the organ recitals first. Get all these old crocs who come along and compare all their, it's not quite comparing all their surgery scars, but it's almost the equivalent of it in a very dignified theological way.
Yeah.
So that's where we are now.
But you continued to attend Pine Rivers Uniting Church when I was senior minister there.
Yes.
And you were very influential in my life, just being someone to sound off, and you had very similar experiences to me of the congregation, and it needed to move forward. And we introduced discipleship and biblical preaching expository, and it just started to grow, It started to blossom again, what were the seeds that were planted were really, really wonderful seeds, and then God was doing something new. And I remember someone saying to me that Barry's last time, he said, God's going to send you someone else completely different to me. And now I am.
Yeah, that's right. And again, it's I'm just trying to think of how to put this. The people that came in under your ministry, a lot of them were not typically church people either.
Yes, we had the highest NCLS for non-church people through our intentional outreach and discipleship programs.
And so you had a lot of people that came in. I mean, deliverance ministry became a natural part of the life of the congregation instead of some big thing that you tagged on to at the end sort of thing.
Responsible.
And people who had been through deliverance, for example, came into the church and became part of the worshipping congregation. And I remember one baptismal service there, for example, where they used to bring in this great big corrugated iron tank. And so that they could have immersion and so on. And I mean, and all these people, some of them had been members right back to the good old Methodist days. But they suddenly found a new sense of commitment and a new sense of openness to the Spirit. And I can remember them standing up on the stage after the baptism was over and giving their testimonies of what this had meant to them in terms of their commitment to Christ. And instead of this being a sort of an evangelistic type language, it was natural. This is, Christ has made a difference to my life, so therefore, and that's the way it was. But those people that came in under your ministry had never experienced anything else but you. And under Barry's ministry, they never experienced anything else but him. But just as you and Barry are totally different personalities, so the personalities of those two groups were totally different. And that's when they brought in Foskito to come in and analyse the whole situation, and he was the one that made the recommendation to the presbytery that there were obviously two complete congregations in the one. And so they split them into two.
And then we, after that, grew the congregation. They went off into a faith community because they weren't happy. And then we grew it again. And so it burgeoned at the seams. We had visitors' rooms built to intentionally welcome people. We had people following up, doing pastoral care. I was busy doing pastoral visits. And I think that's something I echo with you is that you can't just preach from the pulpit. You have to be in people's lives. You have to bring Christ to them and be with them and know them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's been an interesting and varied kind of. I can't say I'm a traditionalist.
Yes. Yes. How would you describe yourself? You're obviously evangelical.
Yeah.
Christ-centered.
Yes.
Yes.
But I remember once some person saying that they were traditionally evangelical with the emphasis on the jelly.
You're always good at the jokes.
And
right?
that kind of stuck in my mind, because so often we have this image of what evangelism is. And,
Yes.
and the one thing I did learn about travelling all around Queensland was that what reached people in one area did not reach people in another area.
Yeah.
And that the backgrounds, the history, the social kind of community that they had, all these things varied from place to place. I remember visiting one old lady who lived in a corrugated iron house.
Completely.
Completely.
Wow.
No,
Not just the roof, the whole house.
no, the whole house. No insulation,
Wow.
no glass windows. They just had those corrugated iron flaps that you pushed out and stuck the stick in and held it out there. And what a saintly old lady she was.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Yes.
But I mean, her experience of going into a church somewhere and sitting down to worship in a typically church congregation, no way would she have fitted in or felt at home.
Yeah. Why is that?
Just because she was so different. And if the gospel meets people where they are,
Yes.
that's what the key thing is, as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely.
And if you don't have to first become churchy so that you can then become evangelical.
In fact, that would insulate people against Christianity,
Sure it
wouldn't
does.
it?
Oh, it doesn't. Doesn't
Yeah.
ever.
Immunise them.
Yeah. So you have to first. Well, you've got to encounter Christ, and that's basically what it's about. And what the gospel is about is Jesus coming right to that person's doorstep, right to where they are. Not them first having to become something else so that they can then, become Christians.
Yes.
And I mean, Queensland is such a diverse population that it's impossible to have a one-size-fits-all type of church or congregation for the whole area. I mean, when I first went to Townsville, it was a very interesting kind of situation there, because the central Townsville, the Central Methodist Church in Townsville, there were two roads that came into this meeting point, and the church was there in the corner.
Wow.
And behind it was the building where there was Lifeline, and there was all the sort of church committees and functions and all that sort of thing. And it was typically Methodist and typically 1950s evangelical, Billy Graham evangelical.
Wow.
And they had the piano and the Hammond organ that played. It was so reminiscent of those days.
Yes.
Lovely, committed, beautiful people, but that's how they saw the gospel.
Yeah.
Then on the other hand, there was another church in Townsville that was absolutely classic Pentecostal. And then there was the West Townsville congregation, which was totally Aboriginal.
Wow.
And that was I mean, it was a congregation that got to the point where they were just about ready to close. And the minister who was sent there with the task of closing down the congregation, giving it a good burial.
That's a sad thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
We see lots of that now.
Yeah, but first of all, he went along there and he said, well, before we close this church, let's pray about it.
That's a novel idea, isn't it?
That's a novel idea, it was. and suddenly the church came alive.
Mm.
And a lot of Aboriginal people came in, but a lot of other people that were seeking the gospel came in to that particular point. And then they moved out of that old Methodist building because it was too small, and moved into a warehouse.
Wow.
And then they moved out of the warehouse and built Praise Chapel in Townsville.
Wow.
Which became a huge, charismatic style ministry.
I've heard things about that church, that they actually taught the Pentecostals how to be charismatic.
That's right, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It was a great story of what can happen in a church.
Yes.
And then there was another church in Townsville, in another one of the suburbs, where they were as close to Anglican as you could get.
Yeah.
In terms of their styles of worship, ministry style and everything else. I mean, if you as a Uniting Church person went to Townsville, if you couldn't find a place where you could feel at home, then you were darn difficult to please.
Yes.
Yeah. and
I've just come back from there. Yeah.
And I mean, this is the people have changed quite a lot since then, but yeah, it was just one of those things where in different areas, in poor areas, churches will function in one way. In rich areas, I mean, so often we talk about the gospel being for the poor. Of course it's for the poor, but it's also for the rich.
Yes.
And when you can do something...
What does it say to the rich?
Sometimes it says, this is going to cost you, buddy.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not a cost that is like the Old Testament. To me, the Old Testament, you had a bunch of people with a fired up faith, and then suddenly they got the 10 Commandments, and they turned it from a faith-based life into a legalistic-based life.
Mm-hmm.
Everything was based on whether you did the right things and had
And
the
we
right...
we see Jesus actually rebuking them for that.
Yeah,
You search the scriptures because in them you think you have life.
yeah,
Yet it is me they testify to, said Jesus, yet you refuse to come to me
that's
to
right.
have that life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and in many ways we've done the same thing with the gospel.
Mm.
What started off as grace and forgiveness and life and the Spirit suddenly became, if you're a Christian then you don't smoke or drink. If you're a Christian then you don't dance. You don't, oh, for crying in a bucket. It became a whole lot of rules and regulations, and you had to either believe in gay marriage or not believe in gay marriage.
Mm.
You had to either accept that you had a sort of messy church where you could do things differently, or that you stuck to the traditions, and and it became so combined, so confined, I should say, by traditional ideas like that.
Mm.
I mean,
What did that do to the church?
well,
Its witness of the gospel.
sometimes it depends on how risky you want to be with it, because I mean, in some churches you almost have to wait for a generation to die out, which is kind of sad. And then if you've got any young people left, for them to come in and take over. I mean, when I went to Enogra...
And train obviously,
Oh yeah,
grounding them
That's right.
so that they're capable of doing that. And
yeah.
how would you see discipleship from your experience as a discipleship consultant and travelling and moderated the whole Queensland Synod. How would you see that, what we did at Pine Rivers when I was there, and you witnessed and you loved, you know, how would you see that part of the church's role, the church not being a building, but the ministry and the people together?
Yeah.
How would you see that as on the priority list, as it should be, and as it is?
I think that would be right up the top.
Right.
I mean, for example, at Inaugura, the church building there, for one thing, they built that church, they were the architect that we got to come to the block of land where the old Methodist church had stood for over 100 years. And his first question was, where does the breeze come from? And I thought, now this man I like. And he designed that church in such a way that in the hot Queensland sun, if there was a breeze at all, doors on both sides of the church opened, and you could get this gentle breeze going right through the whole church to keep it cool. And the great thing about Besser blocks is that the Heritage Commission does not fall in love with Besser blocks.
Yes.
So if you wanted to pull down part of that church and rebuild it in another way, then you could do that. And there wouldn't be the same histrionics that we went through at St Andrews when we had to rebuild and put new tiles on the roof, and they had to be specifically designed and all that. That was a nightmare.
Yeah.
But
so your days then traversing, you retire, you're at Pine Rivers. Tell us about your life. You're a great support to me. We saw many wonders there, and you retired finally. I'd get you to preach now and again, but you really didn't ever retire. You continued to do ministry, didn't you?
well,
and what age were you then?
Well, I'm 82 now.
Yes. Oh, you're young.
Yeah. So it's, I mean, health problems in the family and so on.
Yeah.
Meant that.
But you were still active doing, you know.
Yeah.
Ministry.
I was still active then, but now I'm sort of full-time carer at home, and that's part of my life. And
yes. And that's still part of your ministry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just occasionally there's the opportunity, like today, to go along and visit your father-in-law and grieve over the loss of his wife.
Yes.
And yeah, it's amazing the way things work out and the way things go in cycles. When the Inaugura Methodist Church first began, one of the first ministries that church had was a foot clinic. And this was for the Chinese market gardeners down on the creek.
Wow.
And they used to go down there and look after their feet.
Wow.
And I mean, this was mind-boggling when I discovered this, because the first two children I had to baptize in that church when we built the new building were two Chinese kids. And to think about it, and that boy that I baptized then, he is now the worship pastor in that church. And he leads the worship, and I mean, back then the congregation was kind of controlled by the choir in many ways.
Yes.
Whereas now we've got a young Chinese person who is now the worship leader, and it's a completely different style of, but it's gone from Chinese to middle class white to back to a Chinese leading middle class whites, and it's been an interesting journey.
If you could take one thing that you'd want to say to the United Church and the churches as a whole. Karl Barth used to say that being truly ecumenical could only happen when we all agreed on the God revealed in Jesus. I'm just paraphrasing.
Yeah.
But if there's one thing you could leave as a message for any church, anyone struggling in ministry, because you've been through your struggles, haven't you?
Oh yeah.
It's not been like, would you agree?
Oh. You follow 5 either resignations or breakdowns.
Yes. And takes its toll, doesn't it?
It takes its toll, yeah.
Yeah. If you could give one message to the churches and the United Church, what would it be?
That's difficult to because I've seen so many different parts of the church. It would be different to sort of fit in one message that would go around everywhere.
Yeah.
But it would be that Christ is central.
Yes.
And the way that Jesus dealt with people is the way we should deal with people.
Yes.
And what Jesus said about faith and hope and love, that's
Yeah. And the gospel.
the gospel is, that's what it is.
Yeah.
And yeah, I look at at some of the young people that are coming on now, and I give thanks to God for the fact that they are different,
Yes.
and that they will not be bound down by the old. Oh, God. And I think of the church I grew up in as a teenager. Whereas fortunately in my later teens I went to that church in Rhodesia in Zambia,
Yes.
which was non-denominational.
Yep.
And it was a case of meeting people where they are
Yes.
and answering and listening to what they say, what they're asking,
Yes.
and try to fit what the gospel says
Absolutely.
to where they are.
Yeah. Ray, I'd just like to thank you for all you've done for God and honour you, because people need to honour ministers. Christ himself said so. Not put them on a pedestal, but I'd like to honour you for all you've done, for all the churches you've been involved with. Honour you for what you did with me as Minister and Association at Pine Rivers, and for supporting me and seeing the wonderful things that happened there, and also for you as a person. The example you've been to everyone you've come across through huge suffering, health, everything. And I don't think the average congregational member knows what ministers go through to get that across. So I want to thank you for me and for everyone you've come across. And we love you and appreciate you, and I do.
Fortunately, there are ways that God has of keeping us humble.
Yes.
In that, I mean, one thing in particular, I think I was the last of the moderators to be inducted, or induced, I'm not sure, but in the Wesleyan Church, in the Albert Street Church in the city.
Right.
And the congregation, when I was elected as moderator, they gave me an alb as a gift.
Wow.
And I didn't own one. I mean, I had an old white cassock that I brought over from South Africa with me that was cool, but this alb was really quite something. And of course, in Albert Street, you've got a huge flight of steps to get into the pulpit.
Yes, that's what I was ordained. The first time I wore an alb, and you'd step on the marble steps and step on the hem of the alb, and you'd nearly go face planting.
That's exactly what happened when I had to get up to give my moderatorial address. And I stood on the edge of this jolly thing and nearly ended up cartwheeling into it. I said, Lord, all right, I hear you. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to share it with you.
Ray, I've wanted to hear this for years, and I think people need to hear it. So thank you for joining us, and blessings to you in Jesus' name,
Yeah.
and upon the rest of your ministry, and upon your wife and your family. And thank you for blessing me, and in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy. We rejoice in saying thank you.
Thank you.